More reasons to ditch the UN, that is the topic of tonight's byline. Our problems with the United Nations run deeper than Scooter's decision to lecture us on food. As a country, we face the very real prospect of losing our sovereignty because of UN agreements that we freely sign on to. In fact, agreements we've signed on to and say that we will abide by, well, that's part of Scooter's arguments for the UN to stick its nose into Canadian business. We agreed to sign the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which commits Canada to giving people the right to food. Quote, "The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions." I don't even know how you achieved that last one. Now, as I've explained before, the right to food, housing and the like, well, that doesn't exist in our legal tradition. It's not part of our Constitution. The British concept of rights and liberty that we draw our own traditions from, well, it's one of negative rights. Those are the things the government cannot do to you. The government cannot infringe on your freedom of speech, your freedom of religion, or freedom of association. And if they do, they better have a really good reason for it. Positive rights, like the right to food, are really Marxist concepts that seek to push government deeper into your life. Using the United Nations, the old Soviet bloc countries pushed for these things, and we agreed to them back in the 70s. We're still a signatory to that covenant. Unfortunately, it's not just crazy agreements from the 70s that we signed on to. In 2009, Canada agreed to sign the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Now, there are some good parts to this document. It calls for an end to racism, an end to systems of government based on racial superiority. But there's bad parts as well, such as this. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous people concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. That's being interpreted by many Aboriginals in Canada to mean they need to be consulted and give prior approval to any legislation that they think touches on their lives. And given that they're all Canadians as well, that means pretty much any law needs their approval. That's completely unworkable, but we freely signed on to that document. The Harper government says they don't read the declaration that way, but what will happen when the judges say, yeah, that's how it reads? That's what will happen when this gets to the court, and that is the real problem here. We sign on to these things, then pretend it's all meaningless. Well, if it's meaningless, why sign on? Eventually, these agreements will be used against us in a court of law. Last year, we signed on to the agreement at the end of the Rio +20 Environmental Summit. The document was called The Future We Want. It pledged Canada to implement Agenda 21. Here's a quote from it. "We reaffirm our commitment to fully implement the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, Agenda 21, the program for the further implementation of Agenda 21, the plan of implementation of the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development of the World Summit on Sustainable Development." And it just goes on, listing all these other environmental agreements that we support, some of which actually say private land ownership is bad and we should ensure public ownership. I could go on with other areas where the UN's trying to get Canada to agree. They want us to agree on gun control through the Arms Trade Treaty, which is an attempt at a global gun registry. There's the attempt to have the UN regulate food and vitamins around the world through Codex Alimentarius. They've attempted to ban spanking. Their court interventions to stop Canada from deporting violent foreign criminals. They do all of this because we sign on to agreements. We say we will abide by them. It's time we stopped. It's time for Canada to leave the United Nations. And that's the byline.
I call on the Prime Minister to take all necessary measures with this private member's bill to ensure the compatibility of federal laws with the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
New Democrat MP Romeo Saganash calling on the courts to use United Nations documents to find their rulings, to say Canada must live up to these documents the government says don't matter. Ezra Levant, host of The Source, joins us now. And Ezra, you're not just a person that plays a lawyer on TV, you actually are one. And that's why I want your advice. This is, not legal advice. I don't want to put you on the spot there, but we've got these things that we sign. We say there's a right to food. We say that the native population has to be consulted, and then we say, but these documents don't mean anything. Are we going to have this come back and bite us in the butt?
Absolutely, and we already are. I mean, we see litigation. We did see litigation, for example, to force Canada to comply with an extremist vision of environmental deindustrialization because we signed the Kyoto Protocol. So even though the UN itself does not have the authority, the courts, the police, to force Canada to shut down, let's say, a power plant, Canadians can sue us in Canadian court saying, look, you signed this treaty at the UN, and even though the UN won't do anything about it, you signed it, so you live up to it. That's the problem. When you have a treaty, it's like a contract, typically with another country. But what happens if your own country sues you? Someone in your own country says, you've got to live up to it. That's what Romeo Saganash is doing. He is calling the bluff of politicians who love signing treaties just for PR purposes. He's saying this treaty actually means something, and I want the government to respect it.
And when I look at what is taught in law schools or the views that are put forward by law professors, at prominent schools like Queen's University, I mean, Queen's is not a fly-by-night legal institution. This is one of Canada's oldest universities, one of the oldest law schools. And they teach that this sort of thing, yeah, this is the way you do it. So it's only a matter of time before we get more Louise Arbours on the court to say, yes, you've got to stand by what you said in that UN document.
One of the most terrifying things that I see from time to time in court rulings is Canadian judges being influenced by foreign law. Now, if it's a free speech law from the United States, that's one of the rare instances where I say, I wish we were more like that, because that's about the only law in the world that's freer than the laws we Canadians live in. About 99.9% of the time, if it's a Canadian judge trying to import a foreign law, they're doing so because that foreign law makes us less free. I mean, think about it, Brian. Canada is one of the best countries in the world, one of the freest countries in the world, one of the most free enterprise countries in the world. So if you are importing a law from Africa, from Europe, from Asia, odds are that law would make us less free, less rich, a less noble society. So when a judge does that, they're trying to take away something special about Canada. Now, normally that doesn't work because foreign laws are not binding on Canada and they're usually not persuasive. But when we turn a foreign law into Canadian law by signing on as a treaty, that's when we let the danger into our own house. When you sign a treaty at the UN on anything ranging from firearms control to Kyoto to rules against spanking and the rights of a child, it's not just a symbol. You're saying to the courts in Canada, our government believes in this.
My view is that we should just get rid of the UN, dump it, get rid of it. I'd push the whole building into the East River, but apparently that's not legal. But the Harper government's not ready to do that. Should we at least stop signing on to every agreement just before we head to the bar for the cocktail party? Or should we, if we do sign on, put all kinds of extra conditions in that we're not currently putting in?
Yes, we should definitely put asterisks and footnotes, and we do that sometime. And let us note that last year, Stephen Harper served notice on the UN that we were withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol. And you know what? The world didn't end because all the other countries in the world know that was just a PR document in the first place. I think that the UN...
But then we go down to Rio, and we sign on to this Rio Plus 20 agreement. You remember the Rio Earth Summit in '92?
Yeah.
So they had the 20th anniversary, and the document, the future we want. We agree with Agenda 21. We agree with the further implementation of Agenda 21. We agree with the sustainable development, this and that. In some of those, as I said in the monologue, some of those say private land ownership is bad.
Yeah. Well, and now we see the David Suzuki Foundation borrowing a bizarre law from Bolivia where animals and trees have constitutional rights. The David Suzuki Foundation is trying to change the Canadian Constitution to include rights for nature, they call it. That's just crazy because, of course, the only person who will be able to interpret what nature wants is Saint Suzuki himself. He's a Dr. Dolittle character, I guess. My point is, crazy ideas that start off in faraway countries soon get piped into our country through these transnational NGOs. Now look at the letters NGO, non-government organization. The irony, Brian, is that most of these NGOs are government-funded NGOs, GONGOs, government-organized non-government organizations. It's government circulating with government, unelected, unaccountable. It's like what's happened to the European Union over the last 20 years.
And I've exposed the same circle going on at the UN for how they write the report. It's how Scooter did. Ezra, good talking to you. We'll talk to you again soon, my friend.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Send me your thoughts, byline @sunmedia.ca.